Hi everyone, welcome back. In today's video I'm reviewing what I think will be one of my best reads of 2020 already, and that is The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch, published in 2006. Part 1. Synopsis. The Lies of Locke Lamora is the first book in Lynch's Gentlemen Bastards series. It tells the story of a group of conmen and thieves named the Gentlemen Bastards, and their enigmatic leader Locke Lamora in the city of Camor, which is loosely modelled after late medieval Venice. The lives of the Gentlemen Bastards are forever changed when their world of theft and robbery is uprooted by a mysterious villain known as the Grey King, and they are drawn into a conspiracy to take over the criminal underworld of Camor. Interspersed with the A-plot are several interludes, which follow the story of Locke's earlier years as a conman in training under the tutelage of the eccentric Father Chains. Part 2. A gritty, dark comedy. The Lies of Locke Lamora is a dark, gritty fantasy novel, but at the same time it's one of the most light-hearted and hilarious novels that I've ever read. Now that's a hard balance to strike. Oftentimes I find that dark fantasy tends to just focus on being grim, brooding and miserable, and that can make it somewhat laborious to get through. On the other hand, more comical fantasy novels tend to fall into just kind of light-hearted absurdism, which while fun can sometimes feel a bit lightweight. Lynch gets the balance right between these two things. The first half of the novel is definitely the most light-hearted part, although even there you still have murder and lots of vulgar language going on in the background, suggesting that, things are pretty dark and things are going to get worse. And then we get to about the halfway mark and there's just a turn in the book and things just go full on terrifying and gory and there's lots of violence. But at the same time, even in those later parts of the novel, there's still humour to be found. There's the characters trading barbs with each other, there's the silly circumstances that they find themselves in. So even when the novel is at those darker points, there's still that element of optimism and humour and wit, which is just fantastic, and I think makes the darker stuff a lot more bearable and palpable. Another tactic that I think Lynch uses to kind of keep the novel a bit more light-hearted is to use interludes throughout the novel where we're following Locke and the other conmen as children when they're in training. I think again that adds a certain innocence and youthfulness, kind of vibrancy to the novel as a whole, which again keeps things on the kind of more positive side, rather than just again being this big, scary, dark fantasy novel. Some people do actually criticise those interludes as disrupting the pace, but I actually found them quite nice. It was nice to go back and see how the characters kind of became the people that they were, and oftentimes the interludes were reflecting or significant for the events that were going on in the novel. So I thought they were really good, I thought they were interesting, and I also think that they helped keep the novel a bit lighter in some of those darker points. It's not often that I find myself laughing out loud when it comes to reading, I think because comedy does often require a visual element to be really effective, but with this book I just found myself laughing pretty much consistently throughout the whole thing. Part 3. Strong characters, deep relationships. I found all the characters in Lies of Locke Lamora pretty much to be well crafted and distinctive, and that includes the background characters. Oftentimes in fantasy novels, background characters like, innkeepers, shopkeepers, soldiers, guards, they all tend to just be generic stereotypes of, oh, well, it's an innkeeper, so he must be bald and male and very fat and jolly. Likewise, a shopkeeper, they're going to have their own kind of stereotype, and guards have a stereotype. So none of these characters ever feel particularly interesting, fleshed out, and if they die, you just don't care about them. However, in this book, all of those side characters, whether it's a shopkeeper or a guard, did feel very distinctive. The most obvious thing to talk about on this is the gender balance with the background characters. There was a nice mix of kind of male and female extras, if you like. But it also goes beyond that. It's not just the fact that there were men and women in the background, but it's also that these men and women have, or feel like they have, a distinctive set of motivations, a history, a unique relationship to the characters if they've met them before. And I think that's really good. It's something that adds an extra sense of realism to your novel if your background characters feel like, they have something interesting to say, even if they don't actually say anything, because in this story they're just a background character. Another significant aspect of the characters, now talking about the protagonist, Locke and the conmen, is that they're not the traditional kind of fantasy protagonist. They are, after all, conmen, they're, bad people to an extent, which is something that you don't often get to follow in fantasy. They're definitely anti-heroes rather than the, traditional virtuous hero who goes and saves the day because they want to do what's right. At the same time, though, Lynch does a good job at making us empathise with these characters who are less than savoury. The first thing that he does is he makes pretty much all of the characters pretty corrupt. Camor is essentially a criminal city. It's not somewhere where virtuous people really dwell. It seems that everyone is trying to out-cheat everyone else, and I think that does allow you to empathise more with the main characters in this book, because they're not as bad as some of the people that they're surrounded by. So that gives you a sense of being on their side, because they're certainly not the worst of the worst, they're just pretty bad, they're not full-on evil. I also think that this is another good reason to have those interludes there, because again, the interludes are showing you Locke and the other con men as children, and that gives them a certain air of innocence about them, even when you're following them later on. Because you've seen where they've come from, you've seen them as children, and that makes you feel a sense of connection to them, because you have that kind of knowledge of their past, which is something you don't have as much with the other characters, because you don't get that much of an insight into their childhoods. The final thing to talk about in this section is the relationships between the characters. Not only is the relationship between Locke and the background characters usually quite interesting, his relationships to the central characters is also done really well. There is no romance in this novel. In fact, the only reference to a romance is a reference to a long-lost love of Locke's, who doesn't actually appear in the novel. The focus instead is on the friendships and bonds between the men, or the con men, in The Gentleman Bastards. I really like that choice, because often in, I think, just novels generally, if there's a romance plot, it tends to dominate at the expense of friendship, and it's nice to not have that romantic baggage and just focus on the friendships and developing those friendships with the central characters. Part 4. World building, plot, and prose. I think whether you've read a fantasy novel before or you haven't, The Lies of Locke Lamora has a lot to offer. If you've read fantasy novels before, it's somewhat fresh and different because the focus is on a heist, the focus is on criminals rather than virtuous heroes. But if you haven't read a fantasy novel before, or you don't tend to like the kind of stereotypical fantasy novel, you might find this one a bit of a gateway drug, because its fantasy elements are almost background. The central aspect of the plot, as I said, is a heist and scheming and political conspiracy. And that's something that doesn't necessarily need to take place in a fantasy novel. It could happen in a historical novel, it could happen in a contemporary literary novel. So it does have a somewhat broader appeal for non-fantasy readers. In fact, I might even go as far as to say that this is probably better described as a crime novel with a fantasy backdrop than a just pure fantasy-focused novel. At the same time though, this isn't to say that the world building or the magic or any of that kind of stuff, it's not to say that that is not there or irrelevant to the story as a whole. It's definitely true that Lynch is somewhat sparse on the details when it comes to the more fantastical elements of the world, but he's only sparse in the sense that he's concise and short. He doesn't overload the reader with exposition dumps. He instead uses very concise language in very well-timed parts of the novel to describe things that are relevant to that moment, so that you're always up to date with what's going on. You never feel like you've lost your place in the fantasy world, which, if you saw my worst read of 2009, is a problem that I have with Dune. On the other hand, he doesn't overload you with information, like, say, The Wheel of Time, which, while I love it, there are some huge passages of exposition sometimes, or description, that can bog you down and slow the pace of the novel. Again, I think it gets the balance between the right amount of exposition that keeps the reader on the board with what's going on, and at the same time doesn't get boring or too repetitive. The final thing that I'll mention about the prose is, in addition to being very witty and sharp, he also crafts a very, very realistic and consistent atmosphere and setting throughout the novel. The setting of the novel is late medieval Venice, and it definitely feels like that. The language that Lynch uses to describe that setting is just so consistent in its style and in its tone that you really feel present in the places that you're in. Even though he doesn't necessarily use, again, massive amounts of exposition to describe things, he's really good at using concise language to get across the setting and the place, so you really feel embedded in that world. Part 5, Conclusion. So I haven't actually said anything negative, really, about The Lies of Locke Lamora, and that's because I just don't have anything negative to say, and I don't think, even though it's nice sometimes to have, something critical to say, if you just enjoyed a book and it's perfect to you, then it's also fine to just say that you don't have any flaws with it. And that's definitely the case with this book. I thought the humour was on point consistently. I thought that the dark, gritty realism was done really well. It felt like someone who knows what they're talking about. I also think that the plot was great. I love political intrigue. I like heists and the kind of double-crossing and who can you trust and all that. It's just done really well. The writing style is one that I prefer. got the nice balance between being economical language but also interesting language. So yeah, I just thought that it's a great book. I just don't have anything bad to say. I would recommend it, as I said, to anyone who hasn't read fantasy before but is interested. At the same time, if you haven't read this and you love fantasy, definitely worth trying because it's something fresh, it's something different, and it's just a fantastically well-written novel. Alright, that's it for today's video. Let me know in the comments below what you think of The Lies of Locke Lamora, and also what you think of the next two. I think there are just 3 novels out so far, so the next 2 installments. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more content. I post new videos twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays at 4 PM UK time. But as for this video, that's me done. So take care guys, and I'll see you all next time.